to our seats so we could move to the next session. Okay, welcome back, everyone, and we got a chance to get a drink and recharge. So let's go to the next topic that we want to address, really at the heart of today's symposium, patriotism. The next speaker is going to try to help us think more deeply about the meaning of patriotism at a moment when it is often contested, sometimes misunderstood. Dr. Stephen Smith's work takes seriously a challenge many of us recognize, that love of country can be pulled in competing directions. In his recent book, Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes, he argues for a form of patriotism that resists both narrow nationalism and detached globalism. Instead, he calls for a patriotism grounded in our highest democratic ideals, one that is capacious enough to hold differing loyalties and strong enough to bring citizens together. Dr. Smith is the Alfred Cowles Professor of Political Science and Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, and the author of numerous and influential works, including one of my favorites, Modernity and Its Discontents. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Smith.
Hi, good morning. Great to be here. I wore my orange tie for the occasion. I want to thank Josh Duncan and Cody Cooper especially for inviting me to this event. I was spent a little time listening to the debate earlier and was blown away by many of the points I heard. In fact, most of what I want to say has been fully anticipated by the questions and statements of the debaters and the questions this morning. So I'm not sure what I have to add, but I'll add my 2 cents for what it's worth. I also want to say, Professor Cooper did not mention this. I'm an old Tennessee man myself. I went to UT Chattanooga. Anybody go there? Okay, couple of you, a few of you. It's not. I'm going to go. I haven't been back for years. I'm going to go back. My wife and I, we're going to drive back this afternoon. And I just want to use the occasion, before I get started, to express my gratitude to the place, because it's where I first learned I could be a political theorist. I never knew that. Really before. And for anybody who tells you today, as I sometimes hear, it said college is a waste of time, don't do it, you can do other things, you don't learn anything there. I just want to, and I know you don't believe that because you wouldn't be here, but I just want to say how false that is, because everything I've become, I owe to college, and it was just an extraordinary experience, and love to reflect on that. Also, I just want to say too, the current president of Yale, President Maury McGinnis, is from Knoxville. Her parents were on the faculty here at UT in the School of Education. So there's a Yale-UT connection, Yale-Knoxville connection at any rate. And she told me, when I told her I was coming here, she said to give you a big shout out too from her. Anyway, enough about that. Let me get to the issue of the day. Patriotism, our most contested virtue. At a 4th of July picnic at the home of a colleague several years ago, the hostess of the event asked the group if we all felt patriotic. This created a moment of acute embarrassment for several of the people around the table. Did we feel patriotic? The question seemed to have broached some unspoken rule of political correctness. Was it even appropriate to ask such a question? Had any of us grown up in a house that flew the flag? She had, but none of the rest had. We then read the Declaration of Independence before tucking into our hamburgers and hot dogs. This was scarcely an unusual experience. We were all celebrating our national founding, and yet for several around the table, the meaning of the celebration had become obscure. It is not as if they were unpatriotic, but rather the language of patriotism had become unfamiliar and somehow strangely foreign. Many Americans may have a vague feeling of patriotism, but would be unable to say exactly why they feel this way, nor would they be able to give an articulate explanation for their feeling. And this incident was in many ways the incentive for my writing the book, Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. Mention the term patriot or patriotism on a university campus or in educated circles, and you are likely to hear Samuel Johnson's barb that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Or maybe you will hear George Bernard Shaw's claim that patriotism is the belief that your country is best because you were born there. Or as one of the most famous anti-patriots, Leo Tolstoy, argued, patriotism is simply a piece of collective vanity leading to violence and death. It seems like the anti-patriots always have the best lines. This is not to say patriotism is on the verge of disappearance, far from it, but it has seemed to become ethically challenged in today's cancel culture. Once you leave any urban environment, it is not hard to find people with no reservations about their love of country and are willing to express their views on bumper stickers, on cars and trucks, in bars and diners, and in houses of worship. The problem is that the country they profess to love is often at odds with what many of us would find welcoming. It is often insular, exclusionary, and intolerant. Given this dilemma, then, what is a liberal and a patriot like myself to do? I must admit that one of the secret pleasures I had in writing this book was looking at the expressions of shock, horror, and occasionally disgust on the faces of colleagues when I told them that I was writing a book defending patriotism. I did not suffer martyrdom, ostracism, but certainly was not forced to drink the hemlock, but only suffered some good-natured or at any rate harmless ridicule. My point is that patriotism has always been a contested virtue. Why? Because it must contend with other loyalties to family, to friends, to tribe, to religion. As any reader of Sophocles' Antigone would immediately recognize, the conflict between loyalty to family and loyalty to city is as old as Western literature. Socrates, the founder of political philosophy, was condemned to death for disbelieving in the gods of the city and for corrupting the young, in other words, for being unpatriotic. Today, he might even be labeled a domestic terrorist. Patriotism today must contend with two alternatives that vie for predominance in our culture. On the right, patriotism must be distinguished from nationalism. Nationalism and patriotism initially grew out of a legitimate desire for self-determination and respect, but over time, nationalism has morphed into an ideology of grievance and resentment. It has become a weapon for determining who is in and who is out, who belongs and who doesn't. This is considerably different from the way the term was used in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, where nationalism was generally coupled with the term liberation. Yet the term has largely been appropriated today not for the sake of liberation, but for venting grievance. Nationalist stories are typically narratives of treason and betrayal by unscrupulous elites, in which listeners are encouraged to feel contempt for fellow citizens who fall outside the dominant ethnic group. This distinction between friend and enemy is something that originally applied to international relations, but has begun to cut into our domestic affairs. Or as one recent nationalist claimed, that only about half of American citizens today could be described as American in any sense of the term. Nationalists seek the warmth of community, but usually at the expense of an outgroup that is deemed un-American, regarded as traitors and enemies of the people. Nationalism thrives in the oppositional language of friend and enemy and is impossible without it. On the left, patriotism must be reclaimed from multiculturalism and identity politics. Multiculturalism was originally an academic theory that sought to give voice to previously underrepresented minorities, women, African Americans, gays, but over time has evolved into a race for victim status and for a far-ranging critique of American history. Critical race theory, endorsed by the 1619 Project, dates the American founding from the time when 20 African slaves were sold to the Jamestown colony in Virginia. On this account, American history, even the Revolution itself, was based upon persistent racial oppression and white supremacy. Although these claims have been widely debunked by some of our best historians, they continue to gain traction in public schools and universities. Such views are based on a radical simplification and reduction of all American history to a single theme. The truth is always more complicated. Even at the time of the American founding, the institution of slavery was highly contested. You heard something about that in the debate this morning. The original version of the Declaration of Independence initially included a pointed denunciation of slavery as a practice incompatible with the rights of man. Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton headed abolitionist societies in Pennsylvania and New York. Even the founders who owned slaves believed the institution was gravely wrong. George Washington freed all of his slaves and provided for their future education and provision in his final will and testament. From America's beginnings, slavery was a great source of moral conflict. And to pretend that a defense of white supremacy is the one constant running throughout our history is not true to the facts of our national experience. Slavery is an irreparable stain on America, but it is not the essence of America. So how does patriotism differ from these two extremes that I've sketched out? The idea that we share a common history held together by a collective memory is at the source of the disposition I want to call patriotism. Any true and effective patriotism can only have its foundations in our collective memory, in what we think of ourselves and the story we tell. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story are the final words of Lin-Manuel Miranda's extraordinary musical Hamilton. How we tell the story of ourselves will provide the ground of a common national memory. In how we come not only to understand, but to feel our lives together. It is a recollection of shared history, the locus of a collective destiny, of common misfortunes and triumphs that forges the bonds of a nation and a people. Patriotism is an old, even an ancient disposition. The word goes back to the Greek patris, meaning the place of one's ancestors, more famously perhaps with the Latin patria for fatherland. But broadly associated, it means the love of country. The idea still raises many questions. Like every form of love, patriotism is partly determined by the object of its affection. Is love of country unconditional? My country right or wrong, or is it dependent on our country's meeting certain standards? To make us love our country, Edmund Burke wrote, our country ought to be lovely. But what if it isn't? Then what? There is also the question of what makes love of country an admirable sentiment. In his famous funeral oration, Pericles exhorts his fellow Athenians to feed your eyes upon the city until love of her fills your hearts. Does love of country as a form of erotic attachment force us to ignore the flaws in our beloved? Do we become like Pygmalion, who fell in love with his own creation? Hannah Arendt once wondered whether it is even possible to love an abstraction like a country composed of millions of people one can never know. Isn't love something we can only express toward individuals? Let me begin with the definition. Patriotism is above all a form of loyalty. And to parody the political philosopher John Rawls, loyalty is the first virtue of social institutions. Without it, our collective life could not last a single day. But loyalty is a problematic virtue. We admire loyalty to friends, family, sports teams, even institutions, like UT, up to a point. Yet loyalty also sits uneasily with other qualities we equally admire, qualities such as fairness, justice, mercy, equality, and open-mindedness. These do not always sit easily together. There seems something primitive, almost primordial about loyalty. It seems like the mafia code of omerta. Does loyalty to my own country require me to adopt a hostile or a different attitude, or an indifferent attitude to other countries? What is Ukraine to me? Does it require me to put America first in the jargon of our time? Does loyalty require me to overlook the faults of America, resulting in a form of bad faith? Patriotism is specifically a form of what I want to call constitutional loyalty. Constitutional loyalty has two dimensions. First, ours has been uniquely American exceptionalism. Ours has been uniquely a patriotism of ideas. From our beginnings, we have been a people of the book, or maybe I should say the books. The Puritans, who were the real founders in many ways, thought of themselves as creating a city on the hill, a new Jerusalem in the wilderness of New England. This is why the Hebrew Urim Vitumim, sometimes translated as light and truth, is on the seal of my university. The American constitutional framers followed in their footsteps, attempting to create a text that would stand the test of time. From the beginnings, ours has been a patriotism, again, of the text. And no idea was more important than the idea of equality given voice in the Declaration. And no one has put greater emphasis on this concept than our greatest patriot, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln made the commitment to equality the centerpiece of American patriotism. He called the Declaration, with its claims that all persons are created equal, the sheet anchor of American republicanism. Lincoln's egalitarianism underwrote his vision of America as a nation of free men and women where no one governs another without their consent. And yet there is a second aspect of patriotism that I want to call ethos patriotism. Patriotism is not just a language of ideas. It's a body of sentiment and feeling and disposition that I want to characterized by the Greek term ethos. Loyalty to a constitutional order is more than a matter of ideas and texts. It is not only logos, but ethos. A man's ethos is his destiny, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus wrote. And ethos is not just a matter of thinking, but of feeling. Patriotism is not just a matter of the head, but of the heart. It is ingrained in our moral habits and dispositions. Symbols and rituals are as important as concepts and principles. In fact, the two require one another. These symbols, like the flag or saying the Pledge of Allegiance, may simply be ceremonial affirmations that over time often become dull routine, but routines are essential, such as standing when the Ark of the Torah is opened, is a crucial reminder of something of incomparable worth and dignity. The idea of ethos patriotism, however, runs into an evident difficulty. Doesn't loyalty to one country or one way of life stand, again, in contradiction to the principles of equality and moral inclusiveness that are equally part of American patriotism? How can I regard all persons as equal if my loyalties are to my country alone? How can I regard all persons, perhaps we do not even have obligations to all fellow citizens, but only to ones who can prove that they have roots in the land and the soil, as our current vice president seems to believe? Do our principles stop at borders' end? Where is the line drawn between what we owe to fellow citizens and what we owe to fellow human beings who may be experiencing pain and suffering? Does patriotism require us to forego the sublime teaching of hospitality to the stranger? Some version of these questions is at the core of our current debate about border security and immigration. Are we at bottom a nation of immigrants who welcome the stranger, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, in Emma Lazarus' famous phrase? Or do we require a border wall as a way of protecting our national sovereignty? How broadly or narrowly do we define our regime? Where do we draw this line? In defining ourselves too broadly, we risk losing our ethos. But in defining ourselves too narrowly, we risk losing our humanity. The fear is that ethos patriotism leads to an insular vision of fortress in America, an embattled island in a sea of moral and political chaos. This is not an irrational fear. The world is a dangerous place, and no amount of wishful thinking is going to change that fact. Nevertheless, the loyalty to country does not require me to be indifferent, much less hostile to the needs of others. Loyalty to country is like loyalty to family. Loyalty to family does not require me to think that my family is better than all other families. What would such a claim even mean? I may love my family best, but this does not require me to overlook its dysfunctions. It does, however, require me to give some moral preference to my family over all others. My preference for my child, my wish to see him to get into a good school, have a satisfying career, to prosper and succeed, is not some immoral desire to see him win at all costs, much less a desire that all others should fail. I, in fact, would be failing in my duty as a parent if I were to regard his interests behind some kind of artificially imposed veil of ignorance. And yet, at the same time, I would equally be failing if I did not try to instill some conceptions of justice and fair play. Once again, the fear is that ethos patriotism will compel me to overlook unflattering truths about ourselves and to act on illusions and half-truths. Patriotism, we are told, inevitably becomes a form of bad faith in which we are forced to believe the lie. But I want to argue this is to mistake a distorted conception of patriotism for the real thing. Patriotism requires us not only to take justifiable pride in our country's accomplishments, but feel justified moral shame at our shortcomings. Pride and shame are two sides of the same moral coin, and loyalty is inconceivable without them. Consider only the belated recognition of the Congressional Medal of Honor winners who had been overlooked due to their race. Or to take another example, no one ever accused Ronald Reagan of being unpatriotic, yet he apologized to Japanese Americans for their internment during World War II. What is this but an enlarged conception of who is part of the American family? This is at the core of what I call enlightened patriotism in my book. I have described patriotism as a particular species of love or loyalty. But to return to a question I raised earlier, how can one feel gratitude or love to millions of people that one cannot ever know? This issue was at the core of an acrimonious debate between Gershom Scholem and Hannah Arendt over the publication of her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. In covering the trial for the New Yorker magazine, Arendt had submitted the Israeli tribunal and even the testimony of eyewitnesses to withering criticisms, calling the very legitimacy of the proceedings into question. Scholem could not but regard this degree of detachment as a betrayal expressed at times when the wounds of the Holocaust were still a living memory. It was here that Scholem accused her of lacking what he called ahavat Israel, or a proper love for her own people, the Jewish people, to which Arendt loftily replied that she could not love anything as abstract as a people, but only persons. Still, even though I'm on Scholem's side of this, Arendt had a point. How can anyone feel genuine loyalty or love to something as large and impersonal as a people or a state? Isn't love something that we can only feel toward family and friends? What happens also when these loyalties come into conflict? Unless we had only one friend, conflicts of loyalties will inevitably emerge. For some, my country, right or wrong, is the highest end, while for others, ties of personal friendship are the most precious bonds. The English novelist E.M. Forster, author of Howard's End, famously said that if he had to betray either his country or his friend, he would hope to have the guts to betray his country. This, I believe, is clearly absurd. What if you discovered that your friend was contemplating an act of domestic terrorism that would result in the deaths of many innocent people? Is it really so evident that where your first loyalty would be? Let me consider another example of conflict of loyalties. Last night at dinner, I was talking with a group of students about film, and I can never give a talk without bringing film in. I hope everybody here has watched Francis Ford Coppola's famous Godfather epic. If not, let me tell you about a scene that is particularly memorable. at the end of Godfather 2. Here is a flashback where we see the Corleone family gathered around the dining table in anticipation of a surprise birthday party for the family patriarch. The conversation turns to the surge of military enlistments that the recent Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, due to the recent Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. They're saps, Sonny says, because they risk their lives for strangers. When Michael protests they risk their lives for their country, Sonny snaps at him, "Your country ain't your blood. You remember that." After Michael reveals that he is enlisted in the Marines early in the day, Sonny furiously berates him. "Did you go to college to get stupid?" One of my favorite lines. Sonny is clearly a representative of an ancient pre-modern ethic that holds the family, ties of blood and kin, as the highest form of obligation. It is an ethic that would have made immediate sense in the world of Sophocles' Antigone. At the end of the scene, we see the family united in celebration of the patriarch's birthday, but Michael remains alone, left in thought. It's the last scene of the film. What is he thinking about, you have to wonder? I suggest that he is reflecting on the tension between himself as a member of the Corleone family and as a first-generation American citizen. Which will have the greater pull, the ties of blood and family or the ties of national identity? As a young man, Michael opts for country, but as the saga plays out, we know that the ties of clan and family ultimately prove stronger. It proves Michael to be the person he has been all along, although he didn't know it. Let me take another example, one addressed by Lincoln at the height of the Civil War in his letter to Eliza Gurney, a Quaker woman who had met with him in the White House in September 1862 about the dilemma faced by the Friends, who both supported emancipation but opposed war on the ground of conscientious objection. Lincoln seemed to be deeply touched by Gurney's visit, and in a moving letter written 2 years after their meeting, he expressed his sympathy with their dilemma. "Your people, the Friends," he writes, "have had and are having a very great trial. On principle and faith, opposed both to war and oppression, they can only practically oppose oppression by war. In this hard dilemma, some have chosen one horn and some the other." Lincoln here recognized that the conflict of loyalties between the demands of faith and the duty of country. Perhaps most revealingly, he refrained from interjecting himself in the dilemma. "For those appealing to me on conscientious grounds," he wrote, "I have done and shall do the best I could and can in my own conscience under my oath to the law." For even Lincoln, the commander-in-chief, he could not entirely find a way out of this pressing moral dilemma. One question that I do want to raise, which came up earlier too, is when is patriotism not enough? I'm not speaking here of simply a conflict of loyalties where two courses of action or two loyalties to family, to country may come into conflict, but when is resistance to country morally required, and can resistance be squared with patriotism? Can patriotism be patriotic? We sometimes hear the statement, "my country, right or wrong," but we often overlook the rest of the quotation. If right, to be kept right; if wrong, to be set right. This suggests that love of country is not unconditional. We recently witnessed the Iranian women's soccer team refuse to sing their national anthem at the Asian Women's Soccer Cup in Australia. They were promptly dubbed as traitors by their regime. We tend to support their act of silent and dignified resistance. The question is, when is resistance to country justified, and can it be squared with patriotism? More than any other country, I don't need to tell you this, America made the right of resistance an intrinsic part of patriotism. We began with an act of resistance to the authority of the British Crown, and we called that patriotism. We called the resistors the patriots. And the right of rebellion is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. Yet Jefferson invoked this right cautiously. "Prudence, indeed, will dictate," he wrote, "that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes." This tradition of dissent has not always followed Jefferson's prudence. Our most famous case for dissent, Henry David Thoreau's civil disobedience, defended the right of the individual to withdraw support from government when it involves a clear violation of conscience. For Thoreau, this line was crossed with the American war with Mexico and the annexation of Texas that he saw as little more than a land grab. No one is bound to a particular act of government unless, he believed, one wholeheartedly consents to them, not just through public acts like voting or paying taxes, but internally through the inner voice of conscience. To give support for policies that do not attain this standard of inner agreement is to risk hypocrisy and the loss of moral integrity. Americans can take justifiable pride that civil disobedience has had worldwide resonance, touching everything from Gandhi's opposition to British imperial rule in India to Martin Luther King's resistance during the civil rights movement. Yet the appeal to conscience can be a slippery slope. It is in the nature of conscience to admit of no public standards for verification. Conscience will invariably speak to different people in different ways. American conscience politics has inspired everything from abolitionism to opposition to the Vietnam War to the Kentucky county clerk who refused to issue licenses for gay marriage because she said it was in violation of her conscience. How do we know when appeals to conscience are sincere expressions of a person's deeply held moral beliefs and religious obligations, or just a mask for prejudice and self-delusion? One person's conscience may be another's hypocrisy. Patriotic resistance is the best kind was exhibited in something like Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail that was referenced earlier. King appealed to the country to live up to its founding principles. Like Lincoln before him, he appealed to the Declaration of Independence as America's pole star. Even while protesting Southern segregation statutes, he did not lose faith in America and its progressive aspirations. King's act of simple and dignified protest, like that of Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, shows that patriotism can be combined with resistance. These people stood before the law as citizens who were prepared to accept the judgment of the law as the price for civil disobedience. They did not challenge their country for failing to live up to their own private standards of moral rectitude, but to become consistent with its own best traditions and aspirations. This is patriotic resistance at its best. I am reminded here of Lincoln's description of America as an almost chosen people, the term almost suggesting that there is more work to be done and that this work is not based on a repudiation of who we are, but a call to live up to what is best in our traditions. Lincoln, like Gandhi, King, and Mandela, were all what the political theorist Michael Walzer called connected critics, because their criticism was premised on a prior set of loyalties to the political traditions that they cared most deeply about. These critics avoided moral grandstanding and are closer to Socrates' willingness to oppose an unjust law, but also to submit to its authority. Their protests appealed to what was best in their traditions, not what was worst. Critique is best exercised when it grows not out of detachment and resentment, but out of care and love. This is an example, I believe, from which many of today's social justice activists might take a lesson. Let me begin to wrap this up. Today it is necessary to recapture patriotism from both the nationalists and the multiculturalists. Those on the left have largely ignored patriotism when they have not been openly contemptuous of it. They view any expression of national loyalty as an expression of racism and white supremacy. One reason I cannot accept this view of America as a white supremacist nation is it denies the efforts of generations of Americans, both black and white, in their struggle to achieve a more perfect union. But if patriotism must be rehabilitated from those on the left, it must be recaptured from those on the right. For them, love of country is too often used as a cudgel to separate and divide the ins from the outs. Among the new nationalists are people who see themselves at war with relativism, multiculturalism, and identity politics that they view as posing an existential threat to American national character. The language of fear, invasion, and impurity remain a staple of this rhetoric. Whatever may be the sins of multiculturalists, they are not enemies of the state. We were at war with Germany, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, now Iran. We are not at war with other Americans over their claims to American identity. This language of culture war has turned patriotism into a game of capture the flag, where each side expresses feigned indignation at the moral idiocies of the other. Is protest patriotic? Let me end with a personal story. In the summer of 2023, shortly before the Hamas attacks of October 7th, I was in Israel as part of an academic exchange. One evening after dinner, some friends and I decided to spontaneously participate in a protest against the Israeli government's proposed judicial reforms in Jerusalem. I do not believe I had participated in a protest march since my undergraduate days at UTC when we protested the Vietnam War. The protest was awash in Israeli flags. There was not a hint of violence, and some of the protesters even brought trash bags to clean up after themselves. It was the most orderly and peaceful protest that I had ever seen. This is notably different from recent American protests, when you are more likely to see Mexican or Palestinian flags than American flags, and that frequently end up with burning, and looting. American protesters might take a cue from their Israeli counterparts. Only when protesters learn to embrace the flag and repudiate violence will protest be considered patriotic. Thank you very much. Do you want me to stay here for questions? I don't know. Cody, is that what you...
If you have questions when microphones come, go ahead.
I do my best.
Dr. Smith, thank you for coming and speaking with us. So the Declaration of Independence presents several very strong statements on objective moral truth, the nature of rights, the end of the state, human dignity. Now, it also presents the acceptance of these moral axioms as prerequisites to be an American, a part of the people that the document talks about. Now, to be a patriot, does one have to accept these truths to be an American, as the Declaration posits, or might someone abandon ideals of liberal government favoring the implementation of policy against abortion or other strong moral disagreements in the country?
Okay, wow, you're forcing me to jump in at the deep end here, aren't you? Couldn't you have given me kind of a softball, kind of to get the ball rolling a little bit? That's a great question. It's one I've thought a lot about, and I'm not sure I have come to a full resolution about. I'm not imposing, or it would not be my idea to impose truth tests on people to determine their citizenship or their degree of patriotism. Would we hold the statement that all men are created in quite the same way that Jefferson did? To be a little pedantic about it for a moment, but it is something I've written about, Lincoln interprets the Equality Clause quite differently than Jefferson does. Jefferson says this is a self-evident truth which we hold. This is a truth which we hold to be self-evident. The language of self-evident suggesting an axiomatic character drawn from mathematics or geometry. Lincoln calls equality, in the famous first sentence of the Gettysburg Address, a proposition to which we must be dedicated. No one has to be dedicated to a self-evident truth. It's, again, true whether you believe it or not. But equality for Lincoln came to be something that the future of which was unclear. Writing in the middle of a great war, it was unclear which way it would go. Which way would the country go? Towards equality and emancipation, or away from it? It will be a matter of our dedication. So already the terms have changed somewhat. Having said that, I do believe that the Declaration sets out certain fundamental principles of our regime. Those were actually quite beautifully expressed in one of the speakers this morning, who spoke about the importance of elections, free elections as a form of consent, liberties as the way in which governments protect, and so on and so on. You heard the same speech I did. I don't think we can change the structure of American government, to turn it into something that looks like a monarchy or something that looks like a theocracy or something that, and still say or to turn it into a communist state of some kind, you know, and still say we are patriotic. No, there are limits to what I call constitutional loyalty, loyalty to the fundamental structure of the Constitution. That doesn't mean that we're all going to agree with it in the same way or have the same opinion and share the same sense of moral certainty. But it does set out a range, admittedly vague, admittedly hard to specify, about the limits of where patriotic loyalty lies. I'll kind of leave it at that, but thanks. Please, we met earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. Please, we met earlier.
I want to again thank you, Dr. Smith, for speaking today. My question to you is, you talked about at the very end about the etiquette and advocacy in Israel and how the United States could learn a thing or two from that.
Yeah.
My question is, do you feel the United States, or as a nation or at the state level, should hold violent mobs accountable, like the January 6th attack in Washington, D.C., or another example on the other side of that would be the mob violence that happened in Minnesota in 2020 with the BLM movement? Do you think that we should implement accountability for movements like that on both ends?
Absolutely, absolutely. When you know, one of the examples I use, like Martin Luther King and others that I call patriotic protest, were precisely of people who protested, who resisted, and were prepared, as you put it, to accept responsibility for that. I mean, one of the things I really object to in the kind of current wave of protests is this masking. So, like, you can't tell, it's the ICE too, the same way, this masking that goes on. If you're going to challenge the law, accept responsibility, accept responsibility. And I very much agree with the sentiment that you expressed. Take responsibility for your actions. Yep. Yeah. I think that's very important, to give protest a sense of not only patriotism, but respect in the broader community. We always respect, even if we don't agree necessarily with people, we respect people who take responsibility for those actions, not for those who want to conceal themselves.
Hi, my name is Diora. I really enjoyed your speech. Thank you so much for being here. My question might be a bit silly, but a quote that's quite popular by Kwame Ture is, "Nonviolence only works when opponent has conscience." So my question is, do you believe that the government of America today can hear the nonviolence? Do you believe the White House today has the conscience to make positive change? And yeah.
That's a great question. By the way, I very much admired your talk earlier on. I enjoyed it a lot. It's tempting, and I've given in to this temptation occasionally, to be very despairing about this moment. But I still think that so long as we have elections, and that's a little bit of a question, but so long as we have elections, I think any existing government, even this one, has to be attentive to the people. And I think the recent grudging acceptance of what happened in Minnesota was how that was way over the line is an example of this. So I still think our voices can be heard. It's often too tempting to give in to despair and pessimism, and I can't believe that. I don't want to believe that. And since you're young people, you definitely can't afford to believe that. Thank you. Who else? Yes, the young lady back there. Yeah, you in the black dress. Yeah. Does she have a microphone? Can you be heard? Here it comes, right behind you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for your time today. And on the note of protest, when we consider like what you brought up, how MLK Jr. He believed that any unjust law that doesn't uplift humanity is no law at all. Abraham Lincoln, before he was president, gave a speech, I can't remember exactly where, but he was saying how if you want to change the law, don't just overthrow it, but work through the system in order for it to become changed legally. So how can we be patriotic in protesting laws that we see unjust?
Well, I think it you know, in many cases in politics as in protest, everything depends on circumstance, and it depends what laws you're talking about. But I think that so long as we have voice, we can change. There's a great book. I don't always recommend books by economists, but there's a great book that I like by a man named Albert Hirschman, who wrote a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And it was actually a book about economics, how you can, you know, when firms, you can stay loyal to the product, you can just decide to change the product, or you can use your voice, you can complain to the company about it. But it really is far more appropriate, I think, to politics than really to the world of economics and the world of capitalism. I mean, we can, these are always three options. We can, you know, exit would be the most extreme, and it's frankly not available to a lot of people to just back up and leave. You can remain, you know, loyal, or you can use your voice, and that's always a possibility. That's always a possibility. And as Aristotle says, we are the rational animals, which is to say we are the creatures with voice and with reason and with argument. We can still make ourselves heard. And even in this noisy world of internet and so on, I may have kind of moved away from exactly what you were asking, but I do want to put in a word for voice as one of the options we always have before us. Of course, you know, the efficacy of voice assumes is the last question. We live in a country that will listen. When I look at what happened in Iran, for example, they don't have the freedom of voice. We do. We still do, and we should take every opportunity to make use of it. Please, whoever. Yes. This young woman wants to. She's been in for a while. Had her hand up. Let her get in.
So I have kind of an abstract question.
Yeah. That's okay.
Okay. So I did military intelligence, like naval intelligence, for 6 years, and then I was actively deployed when the Russian-Ukraine war started in 2022. And during that deployment, I also went to Norway for a few months, and in Norway they have like an obligation for a year of service for a lot of like their young adults. And I became more patriotic throughout my service, like seeing how like Russian, Chinese, kind of like those sort of like governments. Do you think that Americans would actually benefit if we maybe implemented like a year service for young Americans and
That doesn't seem to be an abstract question. It seems to be a very real question, and it is actually something I address at the end of my book on patriotism. I absolutely support something like this. And I'll just give you an example from my own experience as a teacher. I mean, every year I see Yale students graduating, and they're looking for what to do after college. Many of them would love the opportunity to do something to serve in some way. And yet, the university does almost nothing to help them, you know, find. There are ways of doing this, obviously, but the university doesn't do much to help. Oh, they bring in iBankers and other firms to campus to recruit. Oh, yeah, that's not a problem. They go to Wall Street. yeah, sure. But if you want to serve your country somehow, whether it's in the military, whether it's through teaching somewhere, whether it's through just some kind of national service, Peace Corps, we don't do much. And yet I say there's a hunger for students who want to do this. And I would be very in favor of, I don't know if in a country of 300 million people we're going to have mandatory national service, but I would love to see universities take a more active part in providing students with the resources to do exactly the kind of things you're talking about, and I don't see them doing much. So maybe institutes like this, the Civics Institute, should have, or maybe does have a kind of public service component to it, which I think is wonderful. I'll just give a personal story from this. Every summer, Yale has a summer program called Warrior Scholars, which brings in young men and women, youngish men and women, usually in their 30s, who have been in one of the branches of the military for several years, and are kind of transitioning out. Some have had some higher education. Most of them haven't, so they're looking to go into some kind of have some kind of college experience. So they come to Yale for 2 weeks of courses, and just kind of get a feel for what college is like. And and they take classes from different teachers, and I always walk them through. My duty is to walk them through the Declaration of Independence. How many of you have read this, I ask? Very few of them have ever read it. They've been in the service of their country for 10 years, 12 years, whatever, but many of them have never read our national mission statement. So we read it together, and then we talk about it. We talk, what stands out? What's the most important word? What's the most important sentence? What challenges you in some ways? And it's an extraordinary experience to see these returning veterans who've had extraordinary ranges of experience, in all of the service, grappling with this text. For me, it's one of my favorite educational moments of the year. So, yeah, I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but that's why I have to read the script, because I will wander off into oblivion. Who else? We have a few over here. I mean, I have time if you do. I'm not going anywhere. Susan, you're pointing. Oh, okay, got it. Okay.
Dr. Smith, in the age of stronger anti-immigration policies, how should one balance wanting to support the institution of immigration in the context of American history and promote American security and identity?
Great question. I punted on it a little bit in my talk, partly because there is no algorithm for determining that question. We live in a world of states. I accept the state as the basic unit of political legitimacy. And to have a state means to be in control of your borders. I mean, if you're not in control of who comes in and who comes out, what is the meaning of a state? So I'm very much in favor, and I believe in the importance of borders and border control. Having said that, I am very opposed to the policies of dehumanization that we see of immigrants, of people fleeing from various kinds of economic and political hardship to just find a better life for themselves. The dehumanization that has been going on is something that I find the most appalling thing. It is not the border control, which I'm largely in favor of. It's how can we have border security and border control without dehumanizing? I think we can. I think we can. I don't believe these two things are in tension or in contradiction with one another. But I think it's important to remember that. And I said if we draw the two, if we draw the if we think too widely, we risk losing our ethos, but if we think too narrowly, we risk losing our humanity. And that's what I feel we're in danger of losing at the moment, our sense of humanity, of what we owe to others, and at least a basic level of dignity and respect that we owe to other peoples.
Dr. Smith, thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciated your talk, as I'm sure everyone did. So it seems the world we find ourselves, well, I should say the country that we find ourselves in now is decidedly bereft of patriotism. To draw a comparison to, 80 years ago, when I would say it's probably our country at its most patriotic. What would you say would be the cause of that, and what would be the path going forward to hopefully get back to that point?
Well, it's a good one. The great jazz trumpet player Louis Armstrong was once asked, where was jazz going? And he said if he knew, he would be there. But I feel a little bit the same way in answering your question. What's happened? Well, so many things have happened. You say 80 years ago, that's roughly, we're talking about World War II and the very end of the World War II period, which was a period perhaps in some ways unique in American history of far greater sense of national purpose and national unity than had ever been the case before. So you're taking a kind of, in its way, a kind of an exceptional moment and suggesting it's the norm. What's broken down? So many things. I mean, the sense of kind of wartime unity is just not possible, or probably not desirable to sustain, in some ways during times of peace too. The kinds of discipline and restrictions imposed on life are just not, again, neither possible nor desirable in peacetime. And then, of course, we've seen there's so many things, cultural effects, technologies have no doubt, the rise of new technologies of communication, mass communication. It's just a cliche to say. Of course, it's true. That's why it's a cliche. We live in a much more globalized world. People don't think about the country in the same way. People increasingly are taught to think of themselves as citizens of the world and somehow global, and problems are global. Pandemics, global climate change, these are global problems, not just national problems. So all of these have contributed, I think, in their own ways to kind of declining faith or declining levels of patriotism. What can be done to, kind of reset the balance? I think I'm a teacher. I have to believe in the power of education. Programs like this, I think, will make a difference. I was going to say a huge difference. It's harder. I've just written a book. I'll just give you a little plug for it. It's coming out in August. It's a little bit of it's not exactly a sequel to Patriotism, but it's a kind of related to it. It's called Unstatesmanship. And it concludes with a discussion of how can the statesmen of the future, can statesmen be educated? And the answer is, well, yes and no. Certainly education helps. And I talk a little bit about the development of programs such as this, these civic education programs that I think are badly needed in today's moral and political culture. So these aren't, there's no magic bullet to this, but I do think in my view, it begins with education. And that's why it's both a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today for something like this. Are we good? Okay.